I have never considered myself particularly attractive in appearance. I don't have big breasts, ample buttocks, graceful legs, or luscious hair to advertise a shampoo. Unlike Helen of Troy, my face would not attract an army of admirers. But despite this, over time I noticed that men were paying attention to me. Perhaps this is due to the fact that I have always had an open and friendly face, and I have always tried to be friendly to others. Anyway, after men started calling me attractive or using similar synonyms, I realized that there was something about me that attracted members of the opposite sex. This thought had never occurred to me before, and I continued to be friendly and open to everyone I interacted with, even those who may not have noticed. By the way, my maiden name was Elizabeth Wharton, and after my marriage I took the name Elizabeth Tipton. When I was 23 years old, I married Henry Tipton. We met in our first year of law school, when he was a graduate student in business school. Like many guys, Henry thought I was attractive, but he could never explain why. He's a nice guy, good-looking, honest, smart, and rarely shows a bad mood, although he played hockey in college, which is considered a rough sport. He also did well in business school. Henry was more persistent than previous suitors, and maybe that's why I fell in love with him. At least that's how I felt. I have never experienced the passionate, concerned, all-consuming feeling that some of my friends have described with their boyfriends. I simply attributed it to differences in personality and my calmer nature. Henry and I planned to spend our 10-day honeymoon in Hawaii. The first 7 days we enjoyed relaxing on the beach, visiting dance clubs. We both loved to dance. Enjoying exotic drinks with umbrellas and having gentle sex. We spent the 8th day of our honeymoon in a non-touristy part of Honolulu, next to a slightly run-down park. I don't even remember why we went there. It was Henry who suggested it, despite my misgivings. While I was sitting on a park bench, Henry went out to get some ice cream since it was a very hot day. It had only been a minute since Henry was around when I noticed a couple of burly guys staring at me. Immediately, I was overcome with anxiety and almost rushed to find Henry, but then I decided that perhaps it was just my nerves. However, I soon realized that my fears were not in vain when they began to approach me as soon as Henry was out of sight. I didn't notice the third guy, who was approaching from the opposite direction from the first two, until he suddenly grabbed me. Suddenly, all three of them dragged me to the car, the door of which was open. The only thing they managed to say was, "Don't resist, creature, or you will get hurt." At least one of them hit me on the cheek when I screamed. I helplessly tried to resist them as they tried to get me into the back seat of the car, but suddenly I heard a groan and a crack sound. One of the attackers suddenly let me go. At this point, the situation became extremely violent and I felt my head hit the car, and then I fell to the ground in pain that bordered on delirium. My left eye quickly became swollen and my thoughts became confused. But, as far as I could see, some big guy with blonde hair was fighting two thugs, while the third lay motionless on the ground. One of the attackers fell on top of me, apparently unconscious, and I instinctively pushed him away. At that moment, I saw how the big blonde man broke the neck of the third guy, and he fell to the ground. My savior pulled the bandit away from me and gently asked, "Are you okay?" I answered something incomprehensible, and a concerned expression appeared on his face. He picked me up like a feather and carried me to his car. He carefully laid me down in the front passenger seat. Then he wet a rag with water from a bottle and began to gently wipe my forehead over my swollen eye. Then he took out a bandage, probably from the first aid kit, although I didn't see it, and placed it on the obvious cut above my left eye. He then disappeared for a short time, put my purse on my lap, and said he would take me to the hospital. I saw him bend over his phone, apparently to get directions to the nearest hospital, and after that we set off. During the trip, I periodically regained consciousness and then lost it again. When I was conscious, I remember looking at him and thinking, this is the most handsome guy I've ever seen in my life. I admired his broad shoulders and strong biceps. He asked me a lot of questions, apparently trying to bring me back to full consciousness, since I was once told in a health class in high school that when there is a head injury, it is important to keep the person awake. All I remember were his questions. Did my rings mean I was married? Where was my husband, and what did he look like? I think I answered his questions correctly. I realized this when he pulled up to the emergency room at the hospital. When he came to pull me out of his car, he said, "It would be great if you didn't tell anyone that I killed 2 of the 3 thugs who attacked you. And please tell them that you don't remember anything about me." I'm sure I muttered something inaudible like, "Okay." When he lifted me into his strong arms, I buried my face, fortunately, on the side of my good eye, into his chest and pressed myself against him as tightly as I could. There was great commotion in the emergency room. The ward officer took my purse, and my savior carefully placed me on the gurney. I extended my hand to him and said, "Thank you. I don't even know your name." "My name doesn't matter," he smiled. And this smile seemed to illuminate the dim corridor of the department with the light of a halogen lamp with a power of 1,000,000 candles. "Just call me Jude, and I was glad to help such an attractive girl." I seemed to fall into unconsciousness as I felt the gurney begin to move. The incident left me with a severe concussion, as well as a swollen left eye and a cut above it that required several stitches. Henry had apparently arrived, although the times I drifted in and out of consciousness made it less clear. This happened approximately 3 hours after the incident. His cell phone number was on the emergency contact list in my purse, and the hospital called him. When I first noticed Henry was in my hospital room, there were 2 other guys next to him. They introduced themselves as detectives from Honolulu and were in plain clothes. They started asking me questions. All I could tell them was that 3 guys attacked me and hurt me, and that some big blonde guy who told me to call him Jude protected me. But I had no more information. I described the 3 attackers as best I could, although my observations were not very accurate. I heard one of the detectives say to the other, "Obviously, 2 guys are dead and 1 is hospitalized, which we found at the open car door." I declined further questioning, and Henry told them that if I remembered anything else, he would call them. Then I fell asleep, or perhaps lost consciousness. I remember that at one point, while in a state of delirium, I had vivid dreams, so vivid that when I passed out, I thought for a few seconds that they were reality. In these dreams, I enjoyed sex with a big, blonde, handsome guy in every imaginable position and place, while in a state of ecstasy. His face, broad shoulders, and biceps were imprinted on my brain with a brilliance I had never experienced before. Due to a concussion, and Henry, I had to stay a day before the doctors cleared me to return to the mainland. Even when I flew back, I had to take medications that made me drowsy. Henry, we talked about what happened. He said that when he returned with the ice cream, I was gone, and he saw the car next to the 3 bodies and immediately called 911. But the way he spoke and some of the details of his story made me think he also couldn't look me in the eye for more than a second when he talked about it, but I just chalked it up to my condition after the incident. When I left the hospital, I met 2 nurses who were there when I checked in. It turned out that they also remembered the incident and were glad to see that I had come to my senses. I asked them about Jude. One of the nurses apparently tried to get his attention, but he politely refused her. I tried to find out as much information as possible from them, but in reality they knew no more than I did. However, they confirmed that this guy is a real find. Within a month of returning home, I was almost fully recovered and continued to do just as well in law school as before. I truly received a lot of compassion and care from family and friends. Only to my best friend did I describe what Jude looked like and tell me about the vivid, realistic dreams I had about him. She studied psychology in college and identified it as a hero worship complex. I didn't tell anyone that I think about him every day. One of the results of the incident was a small scar near my left eyebrow. The scar was easily hidden under makeup and was completely invisible from a distance or when wearing sunglasses. However, every time I noticed him in the mirror, instead of remembering the unpleasant part of the incident, I thought about Jude. After graduation, Henry got his master's degree, I got my law degree, and we both found good jobs. I worked for an intellectual property law firm and Henry in a startup internet company. After about 5 years of marriage, things were going well for us in many ways, but sometimes I had a strange feeling of emptiness. I would be inclined to call our marriage comfortable because we never quarreled. We had many common interests and friends, and we led a good lifestyle. Ultimately, however, I had to admit that I was not sexually satisfied, and my vivid dreams of Jude having sex with me, which happened a couple of times a month, made me very anxious and sad. I went with Frank Fitzsimmons, a partner in my law firm, to visit a new client in a city about 200 miles away. The new client was a relatively large engineering company, Kinetic Force LLC, which had several inventions that they wanted to patent. The female receptionist led us into a spacious and ornate conference room. It was obvious that Kinetic Force was a very successful company. We were soon joined by Jim, the company's president, and Kate, their in-house paralegal. After a few pleasantries, Jim said, "Our chief engineer, Dirk Van Vliet, will be joining us soon. Despite our success, we are newbies when it comes to intellectual property. So, while we wait, why don't you give us a rundown of general information about trademarks and copyrights?" I began to provide general information and answer Kate and Jim's questions as they came. About 15 minutes into our conversation, the door opened, and a guy I assumed was named Dirk walked in. My chatter stopped. My heart stopped. My brain stopped functioning properly. I heard Jim say, "Oh, Elizabeth and Frank, this is Dirk Van Vliet, our chief engineer." It was Jude. There could be no mistake. His appearance was burned into my brain. When I heard his voice, all doubts disappeared. The look of recognition on his face as he shook my hand cleared away the last of my doubts, and when I touched his hand, the electric shock that ran from my brain down was one of the most powerful feelings of my life, so strong that I trembled. Dirk, or rather Jude, came to his senses faster than I did, and chatted with Frank for a few minutes while I looked at him in awe, hoping I wasn't making my feelings too obvious. When Frank asked me a technical question, I finally snapped out of my stupor and carried on a semi-intelligent conversation for the next 20 minutes. Then, to my delight and horror, Jim said, "Elizabeth, why don't you go with Dirk to the prototype floor and then to his office to discuss the mechanical device? We are interested in patenting it, while Kate will take Frank to the laboratory to look at the electrical devices we are developing." Dirk and I didn't really talk when we went out to look at the prototype he had developed. He briefly explained to me how it works. It was all relatively simple, albeit ingenious, and given my mechanical engineering degree, I had no trouble figuring it out by taking a few notes and photos and asking a few questions. When we finished, he said, "Engineering drawings of the device are in my office." When I followed him into his office, we again spoke very little. I closed the door behind me and began to shake. "You're the same Jude?" I muttered. There was silence as we looked at each other. I was shaking. "I've thought about you a lot over the past 5 years," he said softly. "You are the most seductive woman I have ever seen." After his words, I was overcome with a feeling that I had never experienced before. It was a combination of lust, passion, hunger, and madness. I walked up to him, pulled his head to mine, and kissed him with a ferocity that both surprised and stunned me. He responded in kind. We ran our hands over our bodies. As if in a trance, I felt his strong arms turn me around and push me so that my hands were on his table. I had never had such bright, hot, and passionate sex before that moment. For some time, I lost consciousness. I came to my senses when Dirk turned me towards him, while simultaneously trying to put my underwear in order. After a few quick kisses to different parts of my neck and face, he muttered, "I'm really sorry, Elizabeth." I didn't let him finish, but I do not. I dreamed about this for 5 years, only to discover that the reality is even better than the fantasy. "We have to pull ourselves together before we see anyone," he said. "But all I want to do is make love to you." He said, "Make love to you." I was happy. In the next 15 minutes, we managed to recover as much as possible and formulate a plan. Frank would return that night, and I would stay with Dirk for the night, apparently in his house. I learned that his wife passed away 2 years ago from a brain aneurysm. He asked a question, showing his shyness. "Do you think about your husband?" My words seemed to greatly impress him. "Right now, my thoughts can't focus on anything other than the fact that I want to spend some passionate time with you. I have always been faithful to my husband before, but I cannot ignore what I have felt for you in the past 5 years. When I called Henry to tell him I was staying the night, I told him, I am discussing several issues with the inventor of a device that I am going to help patent. This is absolutely true. It seemed to me that Henry sensed that something was wrong, but he did not ask further questions, and there were no signs of affection at the moment of goodbye. The night I spent at Dirk's house turned out to be the most incredible night of my life. It seems like we have achieved some special connection on a deeper level. I felt more comfortable in his presence than I have ever felt with anyone else. Our nightly passion surpassed my wildest fantasies. For almost the entire 12 hours, I was in a state of delight, and my feelings were much stronger than what I had ever felt for Henry. In the middle of the night, it became clear to me that although I had always felt comfortable with Henry, I did not love him, because before I met Dirk, I did not even know what true love was. After that night I spent with Dirk, my married life came to an end. The initial decision was already quite easy, but it was made easier by the information Dirk provided me during the incident. He said that he saw Henry come around the corner of the building with 2 ice creams at the moment when 3 guys attacked me, and then he just threw the ice cream and ran away. I found it hard to believe at first, but Dirk had no reason to lie, especially since I was already his. Then I remembered Henry's strange conversations with me about the kidnapping attempt, and realized that he felt guilty when discussing it with me, which is why he could not look me in the eye. I was also reminded of instances where his accounts of events often changes in detail as he told them to others, and some of what he said never rang true. When I returned home from that night at Dirk's, my first task was to get the details of the incident from Henry. His discomfort in discussing the topic was obvious, including stopping the conversation completely shortly after it began. This confirmation gave me confidence in the veracity of Dirk's story. I didn't mention to Henry who I was leaving him for. I never mentioned Judah or anything related to Hawaii after my first questions about it. But 2 days after I returned, and after several hours of talking on the phone with Dirk, I sat Henry down. I didn't use the standard "we need to talk," especially because I wasn't planning on having a conversation that implied "we need to talk." I just told him, Henry, over the past few days it has become clear to me for the first time that I wasn't in love with you the way a woman should be in love with her husband. I realized that true love only came to me during the last few days. I'm planning to file for divorce before the end of this week because for the first time in my life, I'm truly in love. Henry tried to talk me out of the idea. He was upset that I was not ready to talk in detail. He was angry when I told him that the night on the trip was the first moment of betrayal in our relationship, but I did not feel the slightest regret about it. He called me names that could once have caused me real pain, but at that moment, they meant nothing to me. That same night, I left and stayed at a hotel. By the weekend, I had collected my essentials from our house, either sending them to Dirk's house or putting them in my car. I filed for divorce and notified Henry that the process had begun. I also told everyone in the family that Henry and I were divorcing because I fell in love with someone else. In addition, I have agreed with my law firm that I will be able to work remotely and only go into the office once a month for the next 6 months. After this period, they will have the option to either fire me or I will resign if it is convenient. We also agreed that after leaving the firm, I would not claim any of their clients, with the exception of Kinetic Force, which would remain my client. I got the distinct impression that many people who knew Henry and me considered me a traitor and perhaps hoped that my new relationship would fail, or even thought that I was at risk of contracting a venereal disease. Unfortunately for those who might have hoped for failure, at least until now, which is 10 years after I filed for divorce, none of that has happened. Now, having been married for more than 9 years, Mrs. Elizabeth Van Vliet, I am immensely in love with my husband and we continue to enjoy each other in our relationship. We love each other and spend time together, as well as raising our 2 children. I work part-time in intellectual property at a small firm in our new city and enjoy a full and happy life. Maybe I shouldn't have gotten married until I met someone I liked, for real fall in love, but at that time I didn't know what true love was until Dirk Van Vliet came into my life and saved me.